Federal prosecutors recently began asking defense lawyers for some of those charged in the January 6th cases whether their clients would admit in sworn statements that they stormed the Capitol believing, and this is key, that Trump wanted them to stop Pence, the vice president then, from certifying the election. Joining me now is Ryan Goodman. He is a professor at the NYU School of Law and co-editor-in-chief at Just Security, a clearinghouse of information for all things related to the January 6th attacks. Professor, you find this reporting to be really interesting and perhaps revealing. Why?
That's right. Up until now, we've had no public sign that the Department of Justice was in fact investigating former President Trump. And this really is the first strong indication that they have in their crosshairs, in a certain sense, Trump and his activities, that they would be in fact asking these lower level individuals, foot soldiers and the like, whether or not they would commit in writing and in their plea agreements to saying that they were there at the behest of Trump or because they thought that the president wanted them there. That's very significant. It shows that they're really thinking about him in particular, as the New York Times reports.
And the connection with Trump wanting them there and the specific act is also important. That specific act would be to block the proceedings that were happening, yes?
That's right. And it sounds very much like a convergence of the theory that the Select Committee is working with, that they're asking that whether or not Trump wanted them there to block the proceedings and to put pressure specifically on Mike Pence. And that seems to be what the Select Committee is also looking to as whether or not Trump, how culpable he was for what occurred that day.
Because there is a law about blocking proceedings. I mean, that's what the issue here is. They're trying to get these people to sign statements that would show or might show that an actual law was broken.
100%. In fact, a great number of the people who have been charged with that very law, obstruction of the congressional proceedings. And that's what Liz Cheney has hinted at. She's raised the question, can former President Trump be found liable under that law for aiding and abetting or inciting or being engaged in a conspiracy under that federal crime.
And not for nothing, you have this federal Judge Mehta in the civil case now talking in language very similar to that as well, that Trump's words may have sent people to the Capitol, and the fact that he did nothing for so long to stop them might lend weight to that as well.
Yes, I thought it was a remarkable hearing in which the judge is in some sense providing us all a roadmap for how he may decide, how the Select Committee may work, and how the Department of Justice may work, that the inaction of the president is not just a failure to act, but it actually is a strong suggestion or indication as a matter of evidence that there was an agreement and that what the people did that day, the rioters, was in agreement with him and what he wanted them to do.
I'll follow this language very carefully. It may point everyone in a direction of where things are going. Ryan Goodman, thank you so much for joining us this morning.